There are certain truths so ancient, so deeply buried in the unconscious, that they do not arrive in the form of doctrines or principles, but as dreams, terrifying, symbolic dreams. In one such dream, an alchemist from the 3rd century named Zosimos saw himself walking into a temple where a man was being dismembered, burned, and transmuted. That man, Zosimos realized, was himself. He was both the sacrificer and the sacrificed. He watched himself die, over and over, in a vision that seemed to emerge not from his personal fears, but from the very blueprint of human transformation itself. Over 1,000 years later, Carl Jung would discover these same images, burning, sacrifice, self-dismemberment, surfacing from within his own psyche. But unlike a historian who merely interprets the past, Jung lived inside the symbolic world. He did not study the unconscious as a scholar studies fossils. He allowed it to consume him, and what he found was terrifying, that the ancient dreams of Zosimos were not dead. They were alive in him, and perhaps they are alive in all of us. In the Red Book, Jung confessed something few psychologists would dare to admit. He wrote, "I myself am a murderer and murdered, sacrificer and sacrificed." These words weren't metaphors, they were confessions. Something inside him had died, something had killed it, and both the executioner and the victim wore his face. We like to imagine growth as a gentle unfolding, a steady evolution toward light and truth. But the unconscious does not respect our fantasies of safety. It speaks in rituals, in myths, in fire. In Jung's inner world, change did not come through meditation or affirmation. It came as a ritual murder of the ego. The very self he thought he was had to be torn apart. And just as Zosimos had witnessed his own flesh melting in the temple fire, Jung would watch his identity crumble under the pressure of a power older than time. In his 1942 commentary on transformation symbolism, Jung directly referenced Zosimos. He said, "What I sacrifice is my egotistical claim, and by doing this I give up myself. Every sacrifice is therefore, to a greater or lesser degree, a self-sacrifice." This was not a poetic flourish, it was a spiritual diagnosis. To become whole, to truly awaken, one must murder the false self that clings to power, image, and certainty. Zosimos, in his dream, described a man being led to a cauldron. There, his limbs were cut off, his flesh cooked, and his body transformed into a spirit. The man pleaded for mercy, but the process was already in motion. He was not being punished, he was being alchemically transfigured. This image would become the cornerstone of Jung's understanding of inner work. The cauldron is the psyche, the fire is suffering, and the one who dies in the fire is not someone else, it's you. But here is the cruel twist. The one holding the knife is also you. Jung realized that the unconscious does not allow for division. You are not merely a victim of life's pain, you are also its architect. You are not just the one burned, you are the one who lights the fire. That's what made the vision so terrifying. Not because it was foreign, but because it was too intimate. The ego does not want to die, but it must. And in that process, it must admit that it is both the tyrant and the martyr, both the jailer and the prisoner. This realization is what split Jung away from mainstream psychology. While Freud believed in analyzing symptoms, Jung was being initiated by archetypes. He wasn't just diagnosing neuroses, he was undergoing psychic death. He was becoming, in a very real sense, the modern Zosimos. His exploration was not academic. In the Red Book, Jung describes descending into a blackened space, meeting figures like Elijah and Salome, hearing voices that whispered unspeakable things. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came when he realized that all these visions, all these entities were pieces of himself. He had sacrificed his old identity, but in doing so, he had inherited something far more dangerous, the truth. The truth that no transformation is clean, that there is no salvation without dismemberment, that the ego cannot be coaxed into surrender. It must be taken apart, piece by piece, like the alchemist's body in the dream. And still, the fire does not relent. To understand why Jung was so haunted by Zosimos' dream, we must understand what was truly at stake. This was not just the symbolic death of the ego, it was the shattering of an entire worldview. The dream of the alchemist did not show a man making progress, it showed a man being undone, his skin melting, his body ripped apart, not by demons, but by the divine intelligence within him that demanded transformation. Jung saw this not as pathology, but as necessity. When he wrote, "The sun of the depths also shines in me after the murder has been accomplished," he meant it literally. Something brilliant, radiant, and terrifying begins to shine once the false self is sacrificed. But that sun only rises after the ego bleeds. The 1,000 serpents that try to devour the sun, those are the aspects of the psyche that resist change. They are fear, pride, control, desire. And they are not external enemies. They live inside us. Jung wasn't describing myth, he was describing his own psychology. This is why Zosimos mattered so much. The vision of the alchemist who died in his dreams was not a quaint historical curiosity. It was a mirror. Jung recognized, in that dream, the very process he was going through. The ancient mystics had encoded the stages of individuation long before psychology had a name. They called it the Great Work. They used the language of fire, metal, dissolution, and rebirth. But Jung saw clearly what it meant. Alchemy was the symbolic language of the soul's crucifixion. The fire was suffering. The vessel was the human being. The gold was the self, born only after the destruction of what is not essential. In Jung's private dream journal and his Red Book entries, there are clues, subtle but insistent, that he was unconsciously connecting his own inner journey to the mysticism of the East. In one entry, he writes, "My intensive unconscious relation to India in the Red Book." This wasn't cultural appropriation, it was psychic resonance. He found that the symbols emerging from within him match those preserved in the sacred texts of ancient India. It's no coincidence that Jung was drawn to the Katha Upanishad, one of the most metaphysical and unsettling texts of the Vedic tradition. In the second chapter, verse 19, it is written, "The self is not born, nor does it die. It did not originate from anything, nor did anything originate from it. It is unborn, eternal, everlasting, ancient. It is not killed when the body is killed." Jung cited these verses with reverence, and next to them, in his personal copy, he drew a line in the margin, a quiet but unmistakable act of recognition. Here, in a text over 2,000 years old, was the same terrifying wisdom found in Zosimos' dream, that the self is not who we think it is, that what dies in the fire is not the true self, but its mask, that the part of us which screams during transformation is the part that was never real to begin with. The teachings of the Upanishads and the visions of the alchemist were not meant to comfort, they were meant to destroy illusion, and Jung, unlike most modern thinkers, did not try to reinterpret them into something palatable. He allowed himself to be taken by them. He understood that psychological development is not a staircase, but a funeral. The mind doesn't grow by accumulation, but by subtraction. Every belief, every identity, every defense mechanism must eventually face the fire. And in that fire, there are no spectators, only participants. You cannot outsource your sacrifice. You cannot delegate your death. The one who walks into the temple is the one who is led to the altar. This is why Jung's Red Book is so terrifying. It doesn't offer answers, it offers blood. It tells us that if we wish to be whole, we must be willing to be broken. If we want to see the sun of the depths, we must endure the 1,000 serpents. And above all, we must take responsibility for the knife. The knife that dismembers the alchemist, the flame that burns away the false self, these are not external tools. They are inside you. And until you learn to wield them, they will turn against you. Jung's entire psychology hinges on this terrifying truth, that healing is indistinguishable from destruction, that the shadow must be embraced, not cast away, and that every transformation is paid for with a sacrifice. There is something uniquely terrifying about the idea that you must destroy yourself to become yourself. Not improve, not fix, not adjust, destroy. Jung did not use this language casually. The images he recorded in the Red Book were not sanitized. They were violent, elemental, archetypal. He spoke of murder, of dismemberment, of burning, because that is what it felt like. Not a psychological tweak, but a death. The ego, the structure we build our lives around, does not dissolve with reason. It does not respond to insight. It clings, it resists, it hides behind illusions of control. That is why Zosimos' vision was so vital to Jung. In it, the alchemist is not guided gently into truth, he is sacrificed, and he is the one doing the sacrificing. The self must split in two, the executioner and the condemned. One part must rise with the knife, and one part must kneel to receive the blow. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual process of ego death. Jung saw that the psyche contains within itself a self-correcting mechanism, not a comforting one, a brutal one. When the ego grows too rigid, too inflated, too disconnected from the soul, the unconscious initiates a correction. It breaks the ego down, sometimes through crisis, sometimes through madness, sometimes through overwhelming visions or dreams. And this is the point at which most people run. They call it depression, or spiritual confusion, or burnout, but Jung called it something else. Initiation. This is where Zosimos re-enters the frame. His vision is not simply a warning, it is a prophecy. Everyone who begins the inner journey will eventually find themselves in that temple. Everyone will face the part of them that must die. The process is so intimate, so sacred, and so horrifying that it can only be spoken through symbols. That is why alchemists wrote in riddles, why mystics spoke in flames, why prophets talked of sacrifice. The truth is too unbearable to state directly. But Jung looked it in the face. He realized that no therapist, no teacher, no God could perform the sacrifice for you. You must walk to the altar. You must lay yourself down, and you must watch as your illusions bleed out in front of you. This is the meaning behind Jung's line. I myself am a murderer and murdered, sacrificer and sacrificed. He had entered the myth, not as an observer, but as the protagonist. He saw that in every psyche there is a crucifixion. The ego is nailed to the cross of its own limitations. It must die so that something deeper, older, and more eternal can emerge. But this process is not noble. It is not beautiful. It is terrifying. It feels like madness because, in many ways, it is. The structure of the ego must fracture. The familiar sense of self must become unrecognizable. And for a time, there is nothing to replace it. Only chaos. Only void. This is what Jung meant when he said that transformation is not achieved by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. You do not ascend by clinging to the light. You descend into yourself, into the underworld. In this descent, the dream of Zosimos becomes your dream. You are the one entering the cauldron. You are the one being cooked alive. You are the one whose spirit must rise from the ashes. The ancient vision is not locked in history. It plays out in every life brave enough to face the truth. And yet, there is something even more disturbing in this vision, something almost unbearable. It is this: no one can come with you. The path of inner transformation is utterly solitary. Friends, mentors, guides, they may walk beside you for a time. But when the fire begins, you are alone. Because what must die is yours and yours alone. The dream is tailored to your specific delusions. The sacrifice is cut from your personal ego. The alchemist must die in his own dream. You must die in yours. Jung knew this. That is why he often wrote in isolation, descended into visions no one else could understand, and warned that true individuation is not for the faint of heart. The inner path is not glamorous. It is not rewarding in the conventional sense. It strips you, breaks you, shows you things about yourself that no one should ever have to see. And then, if you're lucky, it rebuilds you. But you do not return the same. You return with the memory of having been burned. And yet, something strange happens after the death. After the burning, after the dismemberment, it does not end in silence. It ends in light. Jung called it the sun of the depths, a strange and radiant force that only rises after the murder has been accomplished. It does not come gently like the rising dawn. It bursts through like a revelation, like a second birth, but it does not shine above. It shines from below, from the place you feared most, from the very spot where you died. This was the final message Jung drew from Zosimos, that the transformation we dread is also the thing we long for, that the terror of ego death hides behind it the one thing no illusion can give us, the truth of the self, But this is not the self we use every day, not the performer, the thinker, the doer. This is the self that watches the ego die, that lives beyond time, that waits beneath the rubble of our masks. This self is what rises from the cauldron, what survives the fire, not untouched, but transfigured. Jung understood that this process could not be rushed. You cannot skip to the light. You must endure the death. You must suffer the contradiction of being both the killer and the killed. And in doing so, you touch something eternal, something the ancient alchemists intuited and the mystics lived, and the sacred texts all pointed to in fragments. That the path to God passes through the grave of the ego. That's why Jung didn't just reference Zosimos as a historical curiosity. He saw him as a spiritual ancestor, a man who had seen, in symbolic dream form, the same inner death that Jung had lived. And if that dream had survived for over 1,000 years, if it had lived on in the visions of prophets and poets and madmen, then perhaps it was not a dream at all. Perhaps it was a law written into the architecture of the psyche, a law that says the old must die for the true to emerge, the mask must fall for the face to appear, the ego must collapse for the soul to rise. But this law is not enforced by violence from the outside. It is lived from within, and Jung knew it. That's why he placed himself in the story. Not as a guide, but as a warning. He wasn't telling you how to be healed. He was telling you how he was destroyed. And yet, what emerged from his destruction was not madness, it was wisdom. The Red Book is not a chronicle of insanity, it is the record of a death and rebirth, a psychological crucifixion, a spiritual alchemy. And like Zosimos, Jung died in the dream, only to find that the dream was more real than the waking world. It is no coincidence that in every mystical tradition, the awakened one speaks like a man who has survived a fire. The Buddha speaks of extinguishing. Christ speaks of death and resurrection. The Upanishads speak of the self as eternal, but only after the body and mind have been seen through. And Zosimos, he dreams of his own sacrifice. He watches his flesh melt, and still, something rises. That rising is what Jung points to when he says, "The sun of the depths also shines in me after the murder has been accomplished." It is a terrible light, because to receive it, you must lose everything you thought you were. And yet it is the only real light there is. This is the paradox. You are not healed by adding more to yourself. You are healed by subtraction, by loss, by fire. The old myths knew this. The alchemists knew this. Zosimos dreamed it, and Jung lived it. The modern world avoids it. It sells healing as comfort, growth as convenience, but the psyche is not interested in comfort. It is interested in truth, and the truth is not pretty. It is not polite. It is a blade, a flame, a sacrifice, and you are the only one who can offer it. Carl Jung once wrote that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But in truth, the greatest burden any of us must bear is the unlived life within ourselves. The version of us that never awakened, that never faced the fire, that never sacrificed the mask to meet the soul. This is the ghost that haunts the modern psyche, not the memory of past traumas, but the silent scream of a life never fully lived. Jung saw it clearly. He saw what happens when people refuse the sacrifice, when they run from the temple, when they try to cling to the ego, patch it up, paint it over, call it healed. But the unconscious cannot be tricked. The fire waits. This is why Zosimos was his most terrifying source. Because in Zosimos' dream, there is no escape. There is no bypass. There is only the alchemist and the cauldron and the knife. And Jung realized, this is the universal condition. This is what it means to become whole. The dream is not a relic. It is a prophecy that repeats in every sincere soul. And what makes it terrifying is not the imagery. It is the responsibility. Because the dream tells us what we don't want to hear, that we are not victims of transformation. We are the ones who must initiate it. We are the sacrificer. We are the flame. We are the one who dies. And there is no one coming to save us from this truth. But still, the dream offers something. A light. A silent promise. That if we do not turn away, if we surrender, if we burn, If we die to all we are not, then something will emerge from the ashes. Something we have never met yet have always been. The self. Jung did not reach this insight through theory. He bled for it. He descended into madness. He recorded visions that made no sense to the rational mind. He confessed to hearing voices, to seeing gods, to speaking with the dead. He walked the very line between sanity and dissolution, and he did it willingly, because he knew that if he didn't, something false in him would survive. And if it survived, the real would never emerge. This is why his red book remained unpublished for decades. It was too raw, too strange, too sacred. It was not written for the academy, it was written for the soul. And now, it speaks to yours. If you are hearing this, it means the fire has already begun. Some part of you knows that comfort is no longer enough, that growth cannot be purchased, that awakening is not a hobby, it is a death. So ask yourself, are you ready to enter the cauldron? Are you willing to become both the murderer and the murdered? Are you willing to light the fire and lay yourself in it? This is the path Jung walked. This is the dream Zosimos dreamed. And this is the inheritance that has now been placed before you, not as a threat, but as a mirror. There will be no applause, no medals, no final certainty, only the quiet breath after the burning stops, only the sun of the depths rising slowly in the ruins of who you once were.